The Kansas winter of 1887 came down like a merciless sentence. The sky was dark as slate. The wind howled across the plains, tearing up what few shrubs clung to the frozen earth. On the wide, white stretch of snow, the Whitfield Ranch stood alone, a fortress of timber against the storm. Wind cut through every crack in the shutters, rattled the shingles, and made the whole frame of the house groan through the night. In the main room, Jonah Whitfield sat alone by the fire. The flames cast a faint glow across his angular face, showing the deep lines carved by time and grief. 3 years had passed since the winter fever carried away his wife and little girl, but the hollow they left still remained. Once this house had rung with laughter. Now it echoed only with the moan of wind and the creak of wood shrinking in the cold. Jonah rose, pulled on his coat, and decided to check the stables one more time before night swallowed the last light. He was no stranger to the harshness of Kansas winters, but there was something uneasy about this storm. Pushing the door against the wind, he stepped into the snow, boots crunching hard against the frozen crust. As he neared the barn, he stopped short. Against the side wall, half buried in wet straw and snow, lay 2 figures curled tight against the cold. A woman in a thin, tattered coat held a boy in her arms. Jonah's chest tightened. For a heartbeat, the memory of finding his wife and child fever-stricken and fading flashed back so sharp he almost staggered. He forced himself to breathe, pushed it down, and stepped forward. "Lord above," he muttered, kneeling. The woman lifted her face. Weathered by wind and cold, her dark eyes carried both weariness and exhaustion. The boy whimpered, hands drawn to his chest, skin gone pale blue from the cold. "Please, don't turn us out." The woman's voice shook, weak but proud. "We just need a roof for one night. I'll work, I'll pay it back." Jonah didn't answer at once. He looked at her, black-skinned, hollow-cheeked, but with a gaze that refused to beg. Finally, he stripped off a glove and reached his hand toward her. "Get up," he said, his voice firm. "You'll both freeze if you stay here." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. It was rough, trembling with cold, but the grip was strong, steady in its own way. Jonah pulled her up and shifted his other arm to carry the boy. "Come with me." They pushed through the snow, the wind striking like lashes. Inside, Jonah set the child on a chair near the hearth and wrapped him in a wool blanket. The woman knelt close, clutching her son's hands, trying to warm him with what little she had left. Jonah pressed his palm to the boy's forehead. Heat burned against his skin. He looked to the mother. "He's fevered." She nodded, clutching tighter. "His name is Thomas. I'm Evelyn. Evelyn Carter." Her name lingered in the silence of the room like a confession. Jonah fetched a jug of warm water and a loaf of hard bread, setting them before her. She whispered thanks, voice hoarse but never broken. When Thomas drifted into fitful sleep, Evelyn lifted her eyes again. Despite fatigue, they held a quiet defiance that stirred something in Jonah. "You saved us," she said, "but I won't live on your charity. Give me work, any work, to repay it. I can cook, sew, clean. I won't sit idle under this roof." Jonah leaned against the hearth, arms folded, studying her. She wasn't like those who came begging. Pride clung to her like armor, forged in hardship. "All right," he said at last. "Consider it a trial. But remember, liars don't last here." Evelyn nodded, her hand smoothing over her son's hair, as if the vow was not only for her, but for him as well. That night, Jonah readied a small room upstairs for them. Before leaving, he glanced back. Evelyn sat beside the bed, holding her boy's hand, her face half-shadowed in lamplight, weary yet unbowed. The image burned itself into his mind. He closed the door and walked down the hall, the house still silent, but not as hollow as before. Something had stirred inside his chest, a feeling he thought buried with his family. But along with it came caution. He knew too well that anyone who entered these walls could bring light or darkness. Back in his own room, Jonah stood by the window, eyes fixed on the storm tearing across the plains. Under his breath, he spoke as though to himself. "We'll see, Miss Carter." The wind still howled outside, relentless. But within the Whitfield house, 2 lives had been spared, and in the heart of a man turned to stone, a small crack had begun to form. In the first days at the Whitfield ranch, Evelyn kept her word. She rose at dawn, when mist still clung white across the fields, hands quick to stir a fire in the kitchen, shaping a simple breakfast of cornmeal and smoked meat. Through the day, she cleaned, washed, patched Jonah's old shirts. By evening, when the horses returned from pasture, she often brought Thomas out to the barn, sweeping straw, sometimes hauling water buckets twice her weight. She worked without complaint, speaking only when spoken to, her voice soft but certain. The black woman showed no weakness, no demands. Instead, every task carried a quiet dignity, something Jonah rarely saw in those who came into his life seeking to cling. He noticed it all: the stooped figure under noon's sun, the calloused fingers wringing cloth. Inwardly, he admitted to a flicker of surprise, even respect. Yet wariness clung hard. He had lost too much to trust easily. At night, when chores were done, Evelyn carried her boy to the small upstairs room. Bare as it was, a wooden bed, coarse blanket, a single lamp, it was shelter from the storm outside. Jonah, passing the hall, sometimes heard her voice drifting through the cracks, low and warm, a lullaby to her child. One evening, Jonah decided to test. He chose the high-backed chair in the parlor by the hearth, embers still glowing. He slouched, loosened his collar, let his breath fall into the rhythm of sleep. Shadows from the fire played across his face, making him look worn, as if undone by the day. The clock struck 10:30. Silence pressed against the windows. Then a door creaked. Evelyn stepped in, her boy in her arms. Her tread was near soundless on the worn rug. She halted at sight of Jonah, eyes flickering, then nodded faintly, believing him asleep. "Quiet now, son," she whispered, setting Thomas on the rug before the fire. The boy leaned into her lap, eyes wide, glancing toward the man in the chair. "Is he a good man, Mama?" the boy asked softly. Evelyn smiled faintly, holding him closer. "Yes, child. A good man can still carry sorrow. He's that kind." Jonah kept his breathing steady, but each word struck him deep, sharp and warm all at once. She bent her head and began to pray, voice trembling as if she feared waking him. "Lord, thank you for this roof, for this fire, and for the man who opened his door. Help him find peace. Let him know he is not alone." Jonah's hand curled against the armrest. It had been years since anyone prayed for him. Thomas lifted his gaze again. "Does he hurt, like Papa used to?" Evelyn drew him tight. her eyes drifting toward Jonah. Yes, a different hurt, but it's still there, in his eyes. And you know what? A man who hurts can still do right. He saved us. The child nodded, lids heavy. Evelyn kissed his hair. Sleep now, son. Tomorrow will be better. By the firelight, Jonah saw her face softened, worn yet steady. Beauty drawn not from finery, but from endurance. Didn't reach for drawers or ledgers, things he had once thought would tempt any stranger. All she did was kneel and pray for a man she thought was sleeping. At length she lifted Thomas, turning for the door. Her hand paused a heartbeat on the back of Jonah's chair, almost touching, then withdrew. She breathed out softly, stepped away, and closed the door behind her. The room was quiet again. Jonah opened his eyes. The fire had sunk low, only red embers left. He drew a long breath, fingers gripping wood. Something unfamiliar stirred inside. Neither trust nor hope, but movement all the same. He sat there a long while, gaze fixed on the dim coals, Evelyn's prayer echoing through his mind. Let him know he is not alone. And for the first time in years, Jonah realized, perhaps he truly wasn't. The days that followed, winter showed no mercy. Wind swept across the endless prairie, driving waves of snow against fences and barns. In that silence, the Whitfield Ranch became its own closed world, where the only sounds were the crackle of wood in the hearth and the occasional thud of hooves from the stable. Evelyn worked without complaint, her roughened hands long used to labor. She cared for her boy, cooked, washed, and helped Jonah with small chores around the place. Jonah watched her in quiet moments, caught between respect and suspicion. At night, as if by habit, he took his old chair in the parlor, the fire's last glow casting its light across his stern face. When the clock chimed, he would steady his breath, feigning sleep. And almost every night, Evelyn appeared, moving like a shadow within the firelight. Sometimes she drew close, her gaze brushing over his face as if to read what lay behind his shuttered eyes. One night, as she pulled the blanket higher across his chest, her hand brushed the open edge of his shirt. The touch was no more than a breath of air, yet it sent heat rushing through him despite the bitter cold. He did not stir, only kept still, though his heart beat fast against his ribs. On another night, she knelt by the hearth, stirring the embers with an iron poker. Flames leapt, painting her face in flickering gold. Stray locks of hair fell loose from her hurried knot, softening her weary features. Jonah, half hidden behind his lashes, almost spoke but held back, afraid to shatter the fragile quiet. One evening, she brought a stone warmed by the fire, wrapped in cloth, and slid it beneath his boots. "So you won't wake with your feet frozen," she murmured to herself. Her hand brushed the edge of his shoe, and Jonah gripped the chair to still his trembling. These small gestures unsettled him. She never knew that the man feigning sleep absorbed every detail, every act of care. Thomas, her 5-year-old boy, added his own warmth to the house that had long known only silence. One morning when Jonah came down to the kitchen, he found the child bent over the table, scratching with a bit of charcoal on a scrap of paper. Evelyn kneaded bread dough, sparing only a glance, letting him be. Jonah stood behind the boy, looking down. The childish lines were crude, yet the image clear. A house with a steep roof, beside it a tall man in a broad hat, a woman in a long dress, and a small boy holding both their hands, Above them, a crooked sun cast out jagged rays. "What's this?" Jonah asked, his voice rougher than he meant. Thomas looked up, eyes bright. "That's my family," he said simply. "There's Mama and me, and you." Jonah froze. The words, the picture, like an arrow through the armor he'd built over 3 long years. For a breath, he couldn't draw air. Evelyn's hands stilled on the dough. Her cheeks flushed, eyes flicked toward Jonah, then fell again. No explanation, no denial. Only silence. Jonah picked up the paper, smudges of charcoal staining his fingers. He held it as though it were treasure. "You think I belong here?" he asked, low. Thomas nodded without doubt. "Yes, because you gave us fire and bread. Mama says good men do that." Jonah turned away, eyes on the flames licking the hearth. He didn't want them to see what stirred in his gaze. Too much rising at once. Grief, ache, and the faintest spark of hope. That night, when he settled again into the parlor chair, Jonah knew he was no longer pretending only to test her. He was waiting. Waiting for the creak of the door, the soft steps, the slender figure to lean down, to lay a blanket or a warmed stone. And each time she did, his heart beat with it. There were nights when their eyes almost met in the half-second before his lids closed. Evelyn would turn quickly away, but the glance lingered like a streak of light across a long night. Jonah knew his suspicion still held, the armor not yet broken. Yet each gesture, each look, each child's sketch was carving cracks in the walls around him, and he feared it as much as he longed for it. This sense that perhaps, after all, he was being called home. Night fell over the Kansas plains like a heavy quilt, pressing silence over all. The wind still howled, lashing long against the wooden walls, rattling the windows in their frames. In the parlor, Jonah sat in his familiar chair, feigning sleep, shoulders slack, breath slow and even. He was used to this ritual now, used to the creak of the door, the quiet steps of Evelyn and the boy. But tonight was different. The door opened, yet only one figure entered. Thomas was already asleep upstairs. Evelyn moved slower than usual, her hands empty. No hot stone, no bundle of kindling. She paused by the desk, where Jonah's ledgers lay scattered. Her back was straight, her thin shoulders stark beneath the plain cloth of her dress. Jonah kept his breath steady, though his eyes strained behind shut lids. A flicker of suspicion passed through him. Those first nights had taught him to wonder if she would reach for what wasn't hers. But Evelyn never touched the books. She only stood a moment, then slipped a folded scrap of paper from her apron. She set it on the desk, close to his hand, in the very spot he could not miss come morning. The motion was so careful it carried the solemnity of an offering. She lingered, her gaze resting on his face. Jonah nearly forgot to keep up the pretense of sleep. He could almost feel her breath in the stillness, uneven, trembling. Then, as if afraid her own heart might falter, Evelyn turned, slipped out, and closed the door bar. Jonah waited a few beats before opening his eyes. The fire had burned to low embers, dim light falling across the pale square of paper. His hand trembled as he picked it up. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged, but the words stood clear. "You deserve to be loved again." He read it once, twice, again. Inside him something broke open, jagged and freeing. Since the fever had taken his wife and daughter, he had never allowed himself to think of the word love. He had locked his heart away, buried it in work and numbers. Yet here it was, written by a woman near stranger, naming aloud what he hadn't dared admit even in thought. The corner of Jonah's mouth lifted, just a little, as if his face had forgotten how to shape it. A fragile smile, awkward, but real. The first in years. But the smile carried fear with it. For in an instant he saw another face. His wife, Sarah, on a summer afternoon, golden light streaming through the kitchen window. Flour still dusted her hands as she looked up and smiled at him. Children's laughter drifted from the yard. He had smiled then too, peace in his chest. Only months later, fever came, and all of it was torn away, leaving silence to haunt these walls. The memory strangled the smile from him. His hand clenched around the note. Fear pressed old and sharp. If he dared step 1 inch closer this time, would he only lose it all again? Jonah rose, pacing to the window. The wind keened outside, snow rattling against the glass. He pictured Evelyn placing the paper, her eyes lingering on him. There was care in every act she gave, a care he wanted yet feared. Part of him longed to climb the stairs, knock on her door, tell her he had read, that he understood. But his feet stayed nailed to the floor. Grief and caution held him bound. He returned to the chair, folded the note, and tucked it into an old ledger, half to guard it as a treasure, half to hide it from himself. That night, Jonah did not sleep. He sat in the dark, listening to the wind, letting the words echo through him. You deserve to be loved again. Upstairs, Evelyn lay beside Thomas, eyes open in the dark. She knew what she had left behind. Fear warred with relief inside her. She did not know if he would read it, nor what he would do if he did. But it was truth, and truth could no longer be kept inside. So they lay awake in different rooms, one man shackled by memory, one woman daring to unlock her heart with trembling words. And between them, a silence took shape, nameless yet shifting, carrying the weight of change. That day, the storm had eased from the rage of weeks past, yet the cold still cut to the bone. The pale sun hung high, spilling its thin light across the white, blanketed prairie. Jonah rose early to tend the stables, while Evelyn moved about the kitchen before the rooster crowed. She forced herself through each task, though her body had been weakening for days. Long nights without rest, heavy labor, and the unrelenting cold had worn her strength away. Yet she never complained, for pride would not allow her to show frailty. By midday, the smell of broth rose from the pot on the stove. Evelyn's head swam. She clutched the edge of the table, the room spinning dark before her eyes. The wooden ladle clattered to the floor. Then her body collapsed beside it. Jonah entered just after. For a moment he stood stricken, seeing her crumpled on the floor, hair loose, face pale and slick with sweat. A memory seized him, his wife once so thin and trembling in fever, slipping away as he knelt helpless. No, Jonah breathed, falling to his knees. His hand pressed to her forehead. It burned hot, searing his palm. Without hesitation, he slid one arm beneath her back, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her. She weighed no more than a bundle of dry sticks, and yet the weight of it crushed his chest. Hold on, he whispered, though she could not hear. Carrying her down the hall and up the stairs, each step dragged a vow from him. He would not let another life slip from this house. He laid her on the guest bed, pulling a heavy quilt over her trembling form. Taking the chair beside her, he stripped off his gloves, soaked a cloth in warm water, and laid it across her brow. That night, Jonah did not leave. The fire roared in the hearth, yet he shivered watching her sweat through the sheets, lips cracked and murmuring nonsense. He changed cloth after cloth, wiping her cheeks, her neck, his hand trembling each time it brushed her fevered skin. It was not desire that shook him, but fear. Fear of loss. Fear of the same emptiness once more. Near midnight, Evelyn stirred. Her lips parted, words faint but clear. "Please, don't send us away." Jonah froze. The whisper struck him like a blade turned tender. He bent low, clutching her hand. Her fingers, hot and damp, curled weakly around his, clinging. "No one's sending you anywhere," Jonah rasped, his voice breaking. "You and your boy. You stay. You stay here." His throat closed, his eyes burned. For 3 years, since laying wife and child beneath the frozen ground, no tears had touched his face. He had made his heart stone, made himself a hollow shell. But now, watching this woman writhe against fever, he could not hold back the flood. Tears spilled hot, falling onto their joined hands. Jonah bowed his head, shoulders shaking, letting the years of silence break. Though half dreaming, Evelyn seemed to feel it. Her hand trembled, tightening over his. Jonah brushed back the damp strands of hair stuck to her brow. "You're not leaving," he whispered. "I won't lose anyone again." The room seemed to shrink to just the two of them, one battling fever, one battling grief, and between them, a cord invisible but alive drew tight. A cord Jonah thought long severed. He stayed there until dawn. Each time she moaned, he rose to change the cloth, to murmur comfort, to keep her tethered. Only when her breathing eased did his shoulders unclench. Outside, snow still fell heavy, but in that room there was fire, sweat, tears, and life. That night, Jonah wept for the first time in years, and in those tears came both release and reckoning, for he knew now with certainty he could no longer imagine letting Evelyn slip from his life. The whispers began in the corners of the marketplace, then spread across town like fire on dry grass. Folks said Evelyn Carter had taken advantage of Jonah Whitfield's pity. Some mocked that she wasn't only seeking winter shelter, but a wealthy man. Such poison was nothing new to Evelyn, but this time it sank deeper, because her 5-year-old son would grow up beneath those same cruel words. One afternoon, while tidying the kitchen, Evelyn glanced at Thomas, asleep on the wooden table. Tears welled before she could stop them. She made her choice. When the weather cleared, she would leave. Any roof elsewhere would be better than raising her boy under ridicule. But fate would not let her go so easily. That night, the skies broke. Rain hammered the plains, thunder cracked, and water rose, swallowing fences whole. The creek behind the ranch swelled into a torrent. Jonah rushed to drive the stock to higher ground. In the chaos, a scream cut through the storm, Evelyn, clutching Thomas, slipping by the raging water's edge. Jonah did not think. He plunged down the slope. Mud sucked at his boots. The current nearly tore him under. But all he saw was Evelyn clinging to her son, her body wavering. He reached them, his arms locking tight around mother and child, and he dragged them up onto higher ground. They collapsed hard against the bank, breath ragged, but alive. Come on! Jonah roared over the storm, eyes burning in the dark. He seized Thomas, grasped Evelyn's hand, and together they stumbled through the muck until the cabin door flew open before them. The kitchen welcomed them with firelight glowing gold. Evelyn tore off her soaked dress, wrapped Thomas in a thick wool blanket, and laid him in the small bed. The boy mumbled, "Mama," before drifting into sleep. Evelyn pressed a kiss to his brow, her eyes blurred with tears. Turning back, she found Jonah standing in the doorway, coat dripping, face taut. The room was quiet save the pounding rain outside. "You shouldn't have risked that," Evelyn whispered, her voice unsteady. Jonah stepped forward, boots trailing dark mud across the floor. He stopped before her, his gaze heavy, and reached for her trembling hand. His grip was firm, anchoring. "I don't fear risk," he said low. "I fear losing you." Evelyn flinched. Her hand was small inside his, burning though her skin was still cold. She shook her head, eyes bright with tears. "But the talk, they won't let us be. My boy." Jonah tightened his hold. "I don't care what they say. They've stolen enough. I won't let them take you and the child too." Their eyes locked. Evelyn trembled, words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him he could not understand what it meant to be a woman marked, judged, cast aside. But his eyes, earnest, fierce, unyielding, left no space for doubt. "You've brought this house back to life," Jonah whispered, his other hand brushing her cheek, sweeping away a bead of rain. "I won't lose that." Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his palm spread through her. Fear, of rejection, of scorn, of loss, melted into something else, long buried yet insistent. In that silence, Jonah bent down. His lips met hers, hesitant at first, then steady. Evelyn stiffened for a breath, then yielded, leaning into his arms. They clung to one another, trembling not only from cold, but from the force of all they had carried. Rain dripped from their clothes onto the floor, hearts pounding louder than the storm. Later, they withdrew to the small room. Thomas slept soundly, his breath even. Evelyn turned to Jonah, her eyes both wary and resolute. He stepped closer, his hand finding hers, fingers entwining. "Tonight," Jonah murmured, "I won't hide anymore. You are the family I prayed God would return to me." Evelyn answered not with words, but by laying her head against his chest. They found each other in embrace, in a kiss deep and certain, in a closeness fragile yet fierce. Damp clothes fell aside, replaced by the heat of skin and the shelter of arms. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the flicker of firelight, fear and loss and barriers dissolved. What remained was breath against breath, hearts beating as one, and a new truth, that from the deepest wounds, love could still take root. When the floodwaters receded, the Kansas fields lay bare in the gray-brown of soaked earth, fences splintered, timbers washed loose, weeds strewn about. The Whitfield ranch would need days of mending. Jonah led the hands in raising the granary again, tying up the stock pens. Evelyn swept, stitched torn cloth, and tended Thomas when the boy caught a slight chill from the storm. But the true storm was not outside. It brewed in town, spreading through tavern talk, market stalls, and church pews. The tale of a black widow living under Jonah Whitfield's roof had become the favorite pastime. They whispered that Evelyn had snared Jonah with weakness, that she held her place through pity, that her presence was a stain on the Whitfield name. At the root of it all was Douglas Merrick, a wealthy trader, smooth of tongue and hard of heart. Years earlier, he had offered marriage to Evelyn, newly widowed and struggling with her infant son. But his proposal was a trap. He sought a pretty ornament to display in exchange for a hollow safety. Evelyn had refused. Merrick never forgot the insult. Now he sowed rumors like salt in open wounds. Leaning at the bar, voice sweet and loud enough for all to hear, he said, "Whitfield, the proud rancher who once looked down on everyone, now lets a black widow share his bed. His pities turned to blindness. Pitiful, really." That poison traveled faster than any storm. Evelyn heard it from a stall-keeper at market, while Thomas clutched her hand. Curious eyes and crooked smiles closed in. On the ride back, she held her boy tight, dread weighing heavy. He would grow under those words, and she could not let that happen. That night, after Thomas slept, Evelyn sat by the fire, hands twisting, eyes red. Jonah stepped in, pausing at the sight of her face. He came closer, sat across. "What are they saying?" he asked, voice low and rough. She lifted her gaze, wet with tears. "They say I cling to you, use you. They say Thomas will carry shame all his life because of me. I can't let that happen to him." Jonah was silent, his eyes like steel. Then he rose, crossed to her, and sat beside her. He took her hand, pressing them firm between his. "Listen to me, Evelyn," he said, voice firm. "You are not under my roof. You are beside me. That's the difference." Her body trembled. His words struck like a shield, but also a danger. She lowered her head, whispering hoarse, "You don't know everything. You don't know my past." "Then tell me," Jonah said. Silence stretched. The firelight etched every weary line into her face. She drew a long breath. "My husband's name was Franklin," she began. "A prospector. He lived on dreams of gold, but drowned today in drink and debt. He gambled away everything. Tools, money, even our small house. I begged, endured, carried our boy through winters cold as knives. Then one day, he left. All he gave me was a note. 'I'll be back when I strike gold. You can guess, the rest.' He never came. A stranger brought word he died in a brawl, leaving blood debts behind him." Her voice cracked. She turned away, tears streaking her cheeks. "I lost it all but Thomas, and I swore I'd never let him pay for another man's folly." Jonah listened. His face shadowed. He understood. Better than most. He too had lost his world in a single blow. His wife and daughter, the laughter that once filled this house, stolen by winter fever, leaving him a walking husk for 3 years. He reached, lifting her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. In his eyes she saw not pity, but a grief that matched her own. "I've lost it all, too," Jonah said, his voice thick. "I buried wife and child on this land, and lived blind ever since. But you—" He took her hand, pressed it against his chest, over the slow, steady beat. "Do you hear? You made this heart alive again." Evelyn shuddered. Beneath her palm, the rhythm was strong, undeniable, hot with truth. "I stay," Jonah whispered, "not from pity, not from loneliness. I stay because of you." Evelyn broke then. The walls she had built high with pride crumbled in one beat of his heart. She fell against his shoulder, her small frame shaking in his arms. Jonah held her tight. as though letting go would mean losing once more. In the warm kitchen, firelight flickering, two fractured souls found their echo. Outside, the town's whispers might rage, but here, for this moment, they meant nothing at all. Early spring clung to Kansas like winter's ghost, unwilling to leave. Winds whipped through town, carrying dust, and with it, rumors that cut sharper than any storm. Douglas Merrick, polished smile and fine tailored coat, stood at the saloon bar, voice pitched just loud enough for every ear. He raised his glass like a man delivering wisdom. "You all know," he drawled, "Evelyn Carter was once mine. A widow with no name, no coin. She begged my protection, and I refused. Now look at her, clinging to Whitfield. A shame, really, for a man of his standing." Chuckles stirred. Some smirked, some sighed as though pitying Jonah. Like sparks in dry grass, the tale spread. Before long, the whole town whispered. Evelyn had begged Merrick once, and now she was nothing but a woman living off men. Evelyn heard it from housewives at the market. Every sidelong glance, every bent head, every whisper burned like fire in her chest. That night, sitting by the window at the ranch, Thomas asleep in her arms, shame and fear tangled in her thoughts. What if Jonah believed them? What if he too saw her as a burden? The thought near broke her breath. But Jonah was different. He had heard, and instead of retreat, a cold resolve formed in him. 3 days later, Sunday bells tolled across town. After service, townsfolk gathered in the square, trading news and letting rumors drift like storm clouds. Douglas stood among them, his long coat buttoned tight, eyes glinting when he saw Evelyn pass with her boy. His gaze sliced with contempt, and his voice carried, "Some folks hide their past, others think they can bury it. But ask yourselves, who was it came to me, begging for bread, only to worm her way now into a rich man's house?" Silence fell. Faces turned toward Evelyn. She froze, clutching Thomas's hand, her cheeks burning with shame. Then a deep voice cut through, hard as a hammer striking iron. "That's enough, Merrick." The crowd stirred. Jonah Whitfield stepped forward, tall in his dark coat, the wind snapping its hem, his stance unshaken. His eyes locked on Douglas. "You've spat enough filth to ruin a decent woman's name. But here, before all, I'll say it plain. Evelyn Carter was never yours. She begged nothing of you. It was I who asked her to stay, because this ranch needs her, because I need her." Gasps rippled. Jonah, the man who'd spoken so little since the death of his wife and child, now stood bare before them, declaring not only defense but truth. Douglas arched a brow, masking unease with a scoff. "Whitfield, you lower yourself for a black widow? You'd drag your name through the mud to guard a woman of no worth?" Jonah stepped closer, his voice rolling like thunder. "What name is worth keeping if it means letting cowards trample others? Evelyn Carter brought life back to my house. She pulled me out of death's silence. If that earns me scorn, I'll bear it. But I will not let you or anyone speak against her." The air thickened, all eyes fixed on Jonah, then on Evelyn. She stood a few steps away, hands clutching her skirt, heart pounding. In his gaze she saw it. Jonah willing to shoulder every sneer, every stone, if it meant she was spared. The world tilted beneath her. Tears pricked, though she held them back. Beside her, Thomas tugged her hand and whispered, "Mama, he's like the hero in my stories." Douglas flushed, fury rising at being shamed so publicly. But the stares around him shifted, from doubt to disfavor, from whispers to judgment. They knew Jonah Whitfield as a man sayupa of his word, a man who spoke only truth. After a tense beat, Douglas spun on his heel and pushed through the crowd, leaving behind only cold stares. When the square quieted, Jonah turned, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. No words passed, but the look, firm, proud, and gentle all at once, struck deep. She understood. He had chosen her side, not just in the silence of his home, but in the open, before a town heavy with prejudice. In that moment, Evelyn knew love was not promises of tomorrow, but a man who stood, bore shame, and fought to guard her honor. And no one had ever done that for her before. That afternoon, Kansas sky cleared rare and bright after days of gloom. Snow melted into dark furrows of earth, and thin green shoots trembled against the wind. The Whitfield Ranch still bore mud and scars from the flood, but for the first time in years, laughter rang out. Thomas ran across the yard chasing the ranch dog, his footsteps light as though no storm had ever touched the land. Jonah stood on the porch, arms folded, watching. His hair hung loose, his dark coat carried the scent of rain and soil. His eyes followed the boy, but his thoughts lingered on the woman inside by the fire. Evelyn. He had seen her strength through these weeks, her pride that weighed heavy even as it carried her forward. And he knew, if he stayed silent, she would find reason to leave again. When Thomas, weary from play, tumbled into the kitchen, Jonah followed. Evelyn sat at the table, bent over a needle, mending the boy's shirt. Firelight traced her face, worn yet proud, hands steady as they worked. Jonah stopped at the doorway, watching long enough that she lifted her eyes, startled. "Do you need something?" she asked, voice calm, though her gaze faltered. Jonah did not answer at once. He stepped forward, slow, and sat across from her. His heart pounded like it would break loose from his chest. At last, he spoke, low, hoarse but steady. "Evelyn, I am not asking for your heart." Her hand stilled, the needle poised mid-air. Her dark eyes wavered. Jonah pressed on. "I don't ask for it, because I know how deeply it's been wounded. What I want is only to give you a place where that heart can heal." The kitchen held still. Only the pop of wood in the fire broke the silence. Evelyn stared, lips trembling. What are you saying?" Jonah exhaled, laying his rough palms on the table, gaze locked on hers. "I lost everything. My wife, my daughter. I know the weight of a shattered heart. But then you came with your boy. You brought life back into this house. You reminded me what hope feels like. And I can't let you walk away." He reached into his coat, drew out a small, time-worn band of dull metal, his mother's ring. He turned it in his hand, eyes bright but uncertain. "Evelyn Carter," he said, each word deliberate. "I want you to stay. Not as a servant, not as a charity, but as my partner. I'm asking you to marry me." Evelyn froze. The needle slipped from her grasp, clattering on the wood. Her heart hammered, breath caught. For years she had lived only to protect her son, to flee shame and hunger. Marriage, to her, had been nothing but a trap, a place where women lost their voice. "You don't understand," she whispered, eyes wet. "I once believed a promise. I gave my whole life into a man's hands, and all it brought me was debt, hunger, and abandonment. I don't know if I have the courage to risk it again." Jonah didn't rush her. He reached, took her calloused hand, and laid it against his chest. His heart beat strong and urgent beneath the fabric. "Do you hear?" he whispered. "It still beats. It beats because I live, and because now it has found where it belongs. I can't promise there won't be storms. I can only promise when the storms come, I won't leave. I will stay." Evelyn's hand trembled over his heart, the truth undeniable. The walls she had built began to crack. In his eyes she saw not pity, not possession, but pain that mirrored her own, a longing to bind, and a gentleness she had never been given. A small, unsteady smile tugged her lips, not toward the past, scarred and broken, but toward the future, where hope lived. "You truly mean this?" she asked, her voice so faint it might have vanished with the fire's hiss. Jonah nodded, eyes alight. "More than anything." Evelyn looked at the ring. It bore no jewel, no shine, just a circle worn with years. Yet to her, it carried the weight of peace promised, of a place where her heart might rest. She breathed deep, hesitation flickering, then lifted her gaze. This time her smile was steadier, warmer. I'm not ready to give everything, Jonah. But maybe I'm ready to try believing once more." He asked for nothing more. Jonah slid the ring onto her thin finger, his rough hand clasping hers, trembling but firm. From the small bed nearby, Thomas stirred. His sleepy eyes blinked open, settling on them, and he grinned. "Mama's smiling. She hasn't smiled like that in so long." Evelyn turned to him, tears spilling yet her smile holding fast. She knew her heart was not fully healed, but she also knew it had found a place to begin. That spring came to Kansas like a gift. After long months of bitter cold, the sky opened in a clear, dazzling blue, the wind carrying scents of fresh earth and newborn grass. On the hill behind the Whitfield Ranch, the small plum tree Jonah had planted 3 years earlier, when he lost his wife and daughter, burst suddenly into bloom. Its fragile white blossoms swayed in the sunlight, like slender threads binding past to present. Jonah stood still beneath the tree, plain white shirt on his shoulders, silver already threading his hair. His face was stern as ever, but his eyes softened with a rare peace. Around him, a few wooden benches had been set in order. There were no crowds, only a handful of townsfolk, those who had witnessed, judged, and at last come quietly to accept his choice. From the house, Evelyn stepped out. She wore a pale blue dress she had sewn herself, simple save for a white ribbon tied at her waist. Sunlight lit her brown skin, her eyes shining though misted with tears. Each step upon the damp ground seemed to lift a weight of years, stripping away the past with every footfall. At her side walked Thomas, in a small vest slightly too big, clutching a wooden box that held the rings. The boy declared himself Jonah's best man, joy sparkling in every bounce of his step. When they reached the tree, petals drifting down about their feet, Jonah lowered his gaze to Evelyn. For an instant, framed in white blossom, her face was a promise made new. The town's old minister, one of the few willing to bless them, spoke in a voice low and steady. His words were plain, unadorned, yet strong enough to bind 2 broken souls together again. "Jonah Whitfield," he said, "do you vow to remain with Evelyn, not only in the bright of spring, but through the harshest winters, in plenty and in want?" Jonah nodded, his voice firm. "I do." His eyes never left hers, his large hand closing around her smaller one. pouring the warmth of his life into her grasp. "Evelyn Carter," the minister turned. "Do you vow to walk beside Jonah, though the road may be hard, but together, never alone?" Evelyn pressed her lips, eyes glistening. Memories flashed, nights fleeing with her child in the cold, days bent under cruel whispers, moments she nearly ran. Yet they all fell away when she looked at Jonah, the man who had stood before the town to defend her honor, who had wept beside her sickbed, who had promised to stay when she believed no promise could be trusted again. "I do," she whispered, a trembling smile breaking through. Thomas grinned, stepping forward to open the wooden box. 2 rings lay waiting, plain and unadorned. Jonah lifted the smaller one, sliding it onto Evelyn's hand. "This is not silver or gold," he murmured, "but a promise to hold you through storm or calm." Evelyn raised Jonah's hand, her fingers trembling as she slipped the other ring onto his. "And I promise," she said, her voice thick with tears, "I will not run. I will stay." Silence wrapped them sweetly. Then the plum tree swayed, and thousands of white petals rained down, covering Jonah's shoulders, catching in Evelyn's hair, falling onto Thomas's small hands, clapping in delight. The minister smiled faintly. "Then, before God, and under the witness of this sky, I declare you husband and wife." Jonah bent and pressed his lips to Evelyn's brow. A long kiss, not of desire, but of gentleness tempered through winter's fire. Evelyn closed her eyes, surrendering to the embrace, her heart for the first time not fractured, but slowly, surely healing. Beside them, Thomas gazed upward, eyes shining. "Mama looks like an angel," he whispered, his childish voice clear as the morning air. Evelyn laughed through her tears, drawing him into her arms before turning again toward Jonah. Behind them, the small graves lay silent, the headstones of Jonah's wife and daughter resting in the plum tree's shade. Some might have called it overlap of old and new. But Jonah knew it was not replacement. It was where sorrow had been carried, and now where love took root again. He looked once at the stones, as if to say, "I have not forgotten, but I still live, and from loss, I have learned to love once more." Petals kept falling, white as snow, warm as spring light. The wedding had no music, no feast, yet in that moment, as blossoms blanketed the earth, everyone present understood. A new chapter had begun. Evelyn stood beside Jonah, her hand entwined in his, Thomas clasping them both. They were no longer 3 separate souls, but a family, woven from grief, courage, and a love strong enough to withstand rumor and scorn. And beneath the white plum tree, love had bloomed anew, rooted deep in soil once watered with tears. Summer came, stretching wide across the Kansas plains in the deep green of young grass and the golden blaze of ripening barley. After the cruel winter, the flood, and the sting of gossip, the Whitfield Ranch felt reborn. Stables once sunk in mud now stood firmer. The granary brimmed with grain, and the fences gleamed with fresh pine. But the greatest change was not in timber or stone. It was in sound, the echo of children's laughter, the quick patter of feet, the mingled voices of 2 souls once strangers, now joined beneath one roof. Thomas raced across the porch, 5 years old now, strong and bright-eyed. He played cowboy on a stick horse, shouting "Yah!" so loud the dog barked after him, circling the yard in happy chaos. Evelyn stood in the doorway, flour dust still clinging to her hands from baking, watching her son with a smile that softened her face. Peace lit her eyes, the kind of peace she had long thought forever lost. Jonah walked back from the stables, shirt damp with sweat, coat heavy with the scent of earth. He paused on the step, gaze fixed on the scene before him, then lifted his eyes to Evelyn's. Between them, no words were needed. Evenings brought warmth to the kitchen, thick with the scent of baked bread and stew. Jonah sat at the head of the table, Evelyn across from him, Thomas wedged happily between, chattering about his games, his small hands gesturing wildly. For the first time in years, Jonah felt the house no longer hollow, but brimming with life. Every childish laugh, every glance toward Evelyn lifted a weight from his chest. He had found, at last, what had been stolen from him long ago. One afternoon, Thomas came with a new drawing. Charcoal smudged across a page showed a cabin, a man in a broad hat, a woman in a dress, and a small boy between them, hands clasped together. At the top, scrawled crooked letters spelled one word: family. Evelyn bent low, tears gathering even as she smiled. Jonah sat beside her, quietly smoothing Thomas's hair, then set his calloused hand over hers. No words passed, but they both knew the long nights of sorrow had led to this reward. A family made new. Work on the ranch shifted as well. Evelyn was not just in the kitchen. She was in the fields, with the horses, hauling water, mending tack. Folks from town raised brows at first, but as the ranch flourished, as they saw Jonah and Evelyn standing shoulder to shoulder, the whispers died away. In time, even the harshest tongues grew still. Jonah too had changed. He no longer lingered in his chair for hours, feigning sleep as before. Nights, after Thomas had gone to bed, he often sat with Evelyn on the porch. Words were few, sometimes none at all. They watched the stars spread wide, listened to crickets and the wind sweeping the grass. Yet in that silence lay a bond stronger than speech. Once Evelyn whispered, voice soft as the night breeze, "The day I first stepped into this house, I only hoped for shelter from the storm. I never thought I'd find a life." Jonah turned, eyes steady, and took her hand. He said nothing, but his grip was vow enough. He would not let her drift again. By autumn, when the prairie turned gold, Thomas began to read. Evelyn guided him through letters by lamplight, while Jonah sat nearby, ledger open but smile tugging at his mouth each time the boy stumbled and laughed. The cabin held more than fire in the hearth. It held fire in the hearts of those within. One winter morning, snow powdered the roof white. Evelyn opened the window for air, turning to see Jonah fastening Thomas's coat before sending him outside. His large, weathered hands fumbled the buttons with clumsy care, and Evelyn's chest swelled with warmth at the sight. She stepped closer, wrapped her arms around them both, and murmured, "This is home." Jonah met her gaze and smiled, a quiet smile strong enough to sweep away all the winters behind them. The end of their long road was not in triumph or spectacle, but in the steady rhythm of ordinary days, shared meals, children's laughter, hands clasped across the years. One evening, as golden light spilled across the porch, Evelyn sat beside Jonah while Thomas played in the yard. She whispered almost to herself, "True love doesn't come from luck. It comes from choosing each other, again and again." Jonah turned, nodded once and reached for her hand. Beyond the fields, spring winds stirred, carrying the scent of new earth. And in that simple wooden house, a new home had truly been built. In closing, it is plain. Happiness is not sudden miracle nor gift of fate. It is forged in choice, choosing to stay, to hold fast, to raise shelter from ruin. Jonah and Evelyn were no longer young. They bore scars, carried grief, but they proved that age, color, and rumor cannot stand against a heart willing to believe once more.